When a superpower starts acting as if it can blockade reality itself, you are no longer watching strategy. You are watching a cockpit with no instruments and a pilot who believes force can replace judgment. I want to begin there because too many people are trying to explain recent events in the Strait of Hormuz as though they are the product of some hidden grand design. I do not see a grand design. I see confusion, improvisation, contradiction, theatrical threats, and a level of deinstitutionalized decision, making that should alarm anyone who cares about peace, law, or even basic statecraft. A few days earlier, we were told there could be a ceasefire. Then came escalation. Then came negotiations with unclear terms. Then came claims that Iran was begging. Then came a blockade posture wrapped in the language of deterrence. To me, this sequence does not reveal a coherent plan. It reveals a governing style that mistakes noise for leverage. I have spent many decades studying international crises. Real statecraft has a recognizable architecture. There are memoranda, there are chains of command, there are competing assessments, there are military evaluations, diplomatic channels, congressional consultations, intelligence reviews, and written records of what each option would likely cost. There is friction, certainly, and there are errors always, but there is still a process by which power is constrained by institutions. What I see here is something different. I see what I would call the one-man override. That is the first mechanism. A system is formally still in place, but in substance it has been bypassed by a single personality. Decisions of war and peace appear to be flowing through impulse, vanity, emotional reaction, and personal bluster, rather than through a disciplined national security process. That is not merely bad management. It is strategic illiteracy wearing the costume of command. Once the one-man override takes hold, the second mechanism appears very quickly. I would call it the bluff addiction. A leader who has spent his life confusing intimidation with intelligence begins to imagine that every adversary is waiting to fold. He believes volume is strength. He believes maximal demands are the same thing as negotiating power. He believes the other side will interpret threats as inevitabilities, but history is full of states that absorb pressure rather than submit to humiliation, especially when they view the confrontation as existential. That is why the American assumption about Iran is so dangerous. If Washington believes Iran can simply be bombed, bluffed, or bullied into capitulation, then Washington is not reading the board. It is staring at its own reflection. Iran has made very clear over time that it will not accept unconditional submission. If it had intended to do so, it would have done so long ago. The core lesson of the recent phase of this crisis is not that American pressure has become irresistible. It is that American coercion has limits, and those limits become visible the moment the target chooses endurance over surrender. The third mechanism is allied veto. This is where matters become even more unstable. The United States and Israel are frequently spoken about as if they are one strategic mind. They are not. Israel, by every practical indication, does not want a durable ceasefire. Israel wants escalation, maximal damage, and the destruction of Iran's capacity to resist. When one partner in a war is prepared to sabotage de-escalation, while the other partner continues pretending that diplomacy remains on the table, you do not have policy coherence. You have a contradiction armed with aircraft. That contradiction matters because it destroys the credibility of every diplomatic signal. One day there is a gesture toward negotiation. The next day there is escalation elsewhere. One side says the terms are this. Another side behaves as though the terms are irrelevant. Intermediaries say one thing, the battlefield says another. And Washington keeps talking as though these contradictions can be smoothed over by better messaging. They cannot. A diplomacy that is constantly undercut by a partner committed to war ceases to be diplomacy. It becomes cover. Then there is the fourth mechanism, the handler vacuum. In a functioning republic, the president is not supposed to be the only adult in the room, and he is certainly not supposed to be the only child in the room either. There are constitutional structures. There are cabinet departments. There is Congress. There are committees. There are officers sworn to provide sober judgment precisely when rhetoric outruns reality. But when those layers fall silent, whether from fear, partisanship, careerism, or simple moral collapse, power becomes concentrated in the least stable hands. That is the part of this crisis that many Americans still do not want to face. We are not looking only at an argument over Iran. We are looking at a broader collapse in the quality of American decision making. This is not a system displaying confidence. It is a system displaying decay. And decaying systems often compensate for internal weakness by projecting external aggression. The performance becomes louder as the capacity underneath it becomes thinner. I want to be very precise here. This is not just about personality, although personality plainly matters. It is about the breakdown of institutional process. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy did not wander through the week posting emotional slogans in the middle of the night and treating civilization like a branding opportunity. He gathered opposing views, listened to argument, tested assumptions, and used structured decision making under enormous pressure. That is what serious governments do when the stakes are existential. What we are seeing now is almost the inverse. By multiple credible accounts, decisions are being shaped inside a tiny circle, heavily personalized, weakly deliberated, and detached from the kind of broad institutional review that a confrontation of this magnitude requires. The result is not strategic clarity. The result is random escalation with nuclear-era consequences. Once a government begins operating that way, it develops a fifth mechanism. I call it imperial hallucination. This is the fantasy that because the United States has been able to impose its will so often in the past, it can continue doing so indefinitely, no matter how the world has changed. It is the refusal to recognize a multipolar reality. It is the belief that sanctions will automatically terrify, that trade pressure will automatically subordinate, that military threats will automatically compel, and that every regional actor must eventually fall in line because Washington has demanded it. But that is not the world we live in. The United States remains immensely powerful, of course, but power is not the same thing as omnipotence. Russia did not collapse on command. China did not bow on command. Iran is not bowing on command. Yet instead of learning from these failures, the foreign policy process keeps reproducing them. The script remains the same even after reality rejects it again and again. Demand everything, overestimate leverage, underestimate the opponent, mistake resistance for weakness, then act shocked when the world refuses to perform the role assigned to it. That is not strategy, that is repetition compulsion at the level of empire. The tragedy is that ordinary citizens are told this is toughness. It is not toughness. It is fragility disguised as swagger. Truly confident states do not need to improvise threats every few hours. Truly capable governments do not confuse social media theatrics with deterrence. Truly serious leaders do not drift from bombing language to ceasefire language, to negotiation language, to apocalyptic language, as though foreign policy were a mood. There is another layer of danger here that should trouble every American regardless of party when legislators become too afraid of their own president to exercise constitutional responsibility. The republic itself becomes one of the casualties. War and peace are not supposed to depend on whether elected officials fear a primary challenge or a hostile post. Yet that is increasingly how Washington behaves. Heads down. No responsibility, no interruption, no institutional resistance. The machinery keeps moving because too many people inside it have decided that personal survival matters more than public duty. A great power can survive external rivals for a long time. What it cannot survive indefinitely is the corrosion of its own governing mind. And that is what I believe we are witnessing. The problem is not merely that this policy toward Iran is reckless. The problem is that the process generating it appears incompetent, personalized, reactive, under-informed, and detached from strategic reality. Consider what the administration seems to have assumed, that Iran would be too brittle to sustain confrontation. That pressure would break the regime quickly, that military displays would frighten rather than harden resistance, that regional escalation could be compartmentalized, that a blockade posture would intimidate without multiplying the danger. Each of those assumptions looks doubtful, taken together. They form a picture of statecraft that is not just mistaken, but unserious. And when unserious people control serious weapons, history becomes very expensive. I have also listened carefully to the language surrounding this confrontation, and it tells us something profound. The language is not the language of measured diplomacy. It is not even the language of disciplined coercion. It is the language of impulse, humiliation, domination, and personal ego. That matters because language reveals the model of the world operating inside the decision maker's mind. If the internal model is that politics is a televised contest of intimidation, then diplomacy becomes impossible, except as performance. Iran, however, is not a television audience, nor is China, nor is Russia, nor is the rest of the world. States make calculations about survival, honor, deterrence, domestic legitimacy, and long-term strategic position. If Washington refuses to understand that other governments are not bit players in an American drama, then Washington will continue producing crises it does not know how to end. I do not say that to excuse any state from responsibility. I say it because analysis begins with reality, not with slogans. And the reality is that the United States cannot simply pound its way through every obstacle in a transformed world. It cannot substitute anger for understanding. It cannot outsource its strategic thinking to amateurs, loyalists, donors, and ideologues while expecting stable outcomes. It cannot pretend that institutions are optional right up until the moment catastrophe proves otherwise. This is why the Strait of Hormuz matters beyond the immediate headlines. It is not only a choke point for energy and shipping, it has become a mirror. In that mirror, we can see the deeper illness of American power as it is currently being exercised. We can see the over-centralization of decision making. We can see the collapse of institutional discipline. We can see the addiction to coercive fantasy. We can see an ally relationship that can pull Washington toward escalation while leaving Washington to explain the chaos. And we can see a political class so intimidated or so degraded that it barely performs its constitutional role at all. A nation can ignore those warning signs for a while. It cannot ignore them forever. So what is the alternative? It begins with abandoning the fantasy that humiliation is a negotiating strategy. It begins with restoring actual process. That means real interagency deliberation, not the theater of consultation. It means Congress doing its job on war powers. It means diplomacy based on defined objectives rather than emotional improvisation. It means recognizing that a multipolar world requires negotiation with other centers of power, not tantrums directed at them. It means understanding that ceasefires cannot survive if key actors are allowed to sabotage them without consequence. And it means remembering that the purpose of statecraft is not to gratify the leader's ego. It is to reduce the probability of disaster. If you ask me what lies underneath all of this, my answer is simple. The United States is confronting the limits of imperial habit, and instead of adjusting intelligently, parts of its leadership are lashing out chaotically. They still believe every problem can be solved by issuing demands from a position whose relative strength has already eroded. They still believe that everyone else must live inside Washington's script. They still believe they can reject reality longer than reality can reject them. That belief is dangerous. And now we come to the choice, not Iran's choice, America's. The United States can continue flying into crisis after crisis with the instruments dark, letting personalized impulse replace structured judgment, letting fear silence Congress, letting allies set fire to diplomacy, letting imperial nostalgia masquerade as strategy. That road does not lead to restored strength. It leads to larger failures, wider wars, deeper humiliation, and eventually a reckoning with realities that should have been faced much earlier and at much lower cost. Or the United States can decide that power without process is decay, that coercion without strategy is weakness, and that a nation serious about peace must first become serious about how it makes decisions. That not whether Washington can shout louder, whether it can learn before the next escalation makes learning vastly more expensive.